Before sunrise, before bells or prayers, life was already moving at the bottom of medieval society, not with purpose or hope, but with necessity. For most people in medieval Europe, existence began and ended with survival. They did not live in castles or stone houses. They lived close to the ground, in huts of mud, wood, and straw. Smoke clung to the air inside their homes, with no chimney to escape through. The floor was bare earth, often damp, sometimes frozen. Animals shared the same space, not out of affection, but because their body heat mattered. This was the world of the poor. They were the majority, yet their lives left almost no record. They did not write chronicles. They did not commission art. What we know of them comes from laws written to control them, taxes imposed on them, and punishments designed for them. Their days began early because daylight was precious and short. In winter, hunger woke them before the sun. In summer, labor did. There was no concept of rest as we understand it. The body worked until it could no longer move, and then worked again the next day. Food was never guaranteed. Bread was the foundation of survival, but even that was uncertain. Grain harvests depended on weather, soil, and luck. A single bad season could mean famine. A few bad seasons could empty entire villages. When bread was scarce, it was stretched with whatever could be found: ground peas, acorns, sawdust, sometimes dirt. Meat was rare. For most peasants, it appeared only on feast days, if at all. Hunting was forbidden. Forests belonged to nobles and kings. To take a deer or a boar was a crime punished harshly. Even gathering fallen wood could be illegal. Hunger was constant, not dramatic, not sudden. It was a quiet companion that never left. Children grew up thin, adults aged quickly, teeth rotted, bodies weakened, disease followed. Illness was not understood. There was no germ theory, no antibiotics, no real treatment. A fever could be a death sentence. An infected cut could kill within days. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Many women did not survive it. Many children did not survive infancy. Death was familiar. Bodies were washed, buried, and forgotten with little ceremony. Graves were shallow. Cemeteries were crowded. During plagues or famines, there was often no burial at all. The dead were stacked, covered, and left. Fear shaped behavior. Fear of hunger, fear of disease, fear of punishment. Medieval law was not designed to protect the poor. It existed to maintain order and property. Laws were harsh, simple, and unevenly enforced. A peasant stealing bread could lose a hand. A noble committing the same crime might pay a fine or nothing at all. Public punishment was common. It was meant to be seen. Stocks, pillories, whipping posts stood in village squares. The suffering of one was intended to control the many. Shame was part of the sentence. Pain was the rest. Prisons, as we imagine them, barely existed. Punishment was immediate and physical. Mutilation was common. Branding, ear cutting, eye removal, execution. For the poor, justice was unpredictable. A bad harvest could turn desperation into crime. Crime could turn into death. Work was relentless. Most peasants were tied to the land as serfs. They did not own the fields they worked. They owed labor to a lord in exchange for protection and the right to exist on the land. Several days a week were spent working the lord's fields. The rest were spent trying to feed their own families. There was no escape. Birth determined fate. Children inherited their parents' status, their debts, their obligations. Education was rare, literacy almost non-existent. Knowledge passed through repetition, not books. Homes were crowded. Families were large because survival demanded it. More children meant more labor. It also meant more mouths to feed. Many did not survive. Parents learned not to become attached too quickly. Clothing was simple and worn, one or two outfits at most. Shoes were a luxury. In winter, cold seeped into bones. In summer, sweat and insects brought infection. Bathing was infrequent, not from ignorance, but from lack of resources. Water was often contaminated. Wells sat near latrines. Rivers carried waste from upstream. Dysentery and parasites were common. Weakness followed. Religion offered explanation, not relief. Suffering was framed as divine will. Poverty was seen as a test or a punishment. Heaven promised reward later, not now. The church preached obedience. Rebellion was sinful. Acceptance was virtuous. Yet faith was not comfort for everyone. Many feared damnation as much as hunger. Hell was described in vivid detail. Eternal punishment mirrored earthly pain, only worse. Violence was ordinary. Wars passed through villages like storms. Armies took food, livestock, and people. Peasants had no protection. They were not soldiers, they were resources. When war came, survival depended on hiding or fleeing, often with nothing. Women faced additional burdens. They worked the fields, cared for children, cooked, cleaned, and labored until exhaustion. Their legal rights were limited. Abuse was common and rarely punished. Widowhood could mean ruin. Without a male protector, survival became even harder. Children worked early. As soon as they could walk steadily, they were useful, fetching water, watching animals, gathering fuel. Childhood as a protected stage of life did not exist. Old age was rare. Those who reached it often depended on family or charity. Without support, they begged. Begging itself could be illegal. Despite everything, people endured. They formed small communities, shared tools, shared grief, celebrated rare feast days when food was plentiful, sang songs, told stories. These moments did not erase suffering, but they softened it. Life at the bottom of medieval society was not heroic. It was not exceptional. It was ordinary. And that is what made it so brutal. This was the reality for most people who lived during the Middle Ages, not knights or kings, but the silent majority whose lives were shaped by hunger, fear, and labor.
Morning light filtered through cracks in the walls. Smoke rose from small fires, carrying the scent of wet straw, burned wood, and cooking grain. It was a familiar smell, one that marked the beginning of another day of work and endurance. The first task was water. Wells were often distant or contaminated. Peasants carried buckets, sometimes long distances, risking mud, ice, or disease. A simple task could become exhausting. Those who failed to bring enough water risked thirst, poor cooking, and illness. Water shaped life more than most laws or decrees. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was thin. A small piece of coarse bread, perhaps soaked in weak ale or milk, was often the only nourishment before hours of labor. Children ate less, quietly enduring hunger as they prepared for work in the fields. Adults barely noticed their own emptiness, focused instead on the toil ahead. The fields demanded attention. Soil had to be plowed, planted, weeded, and harvested. Tools were crude, iron was scarce. Wooden plows and hoes pressed against the earth, guided by hands raw from cold or sun. Workdays stretched from dawn to dusk. Rain or frost mattered little. A poor harvest could destroy a family's chance to survive. Serfs owed labor to their lord. This was not voluntary. Miss a day, and punishment followed. Fines were rare. Pain was common. Whipping, flogging, or beating reinforced obedience. Lords walked their lands with eyes that missed nothing. Fear ensured compliance. Even when the body protested, work continued. Children were present in the fields, carrying small loads, scaring animals, or tending younger siblings. Play was rare. Misbehavior could provoke a sharp word or worse. Yet in brief moments, laughter occurred, a fleeting rebellion against harsh reality. These small joys did not erase suffering, but they kept people human. Meals were minimal. Lunch might be a small bowl of pottage, a thin stew of vegetables or grains. Meat was a distant memory, preserved only in stories or during religious festivals. Malnutrition was visible. Swollen bellies from parasites, thin limbs, pale skin, and sores that refused to heal. Yet each day they ate what they could, no matter how little. Disease stalked every home. Illnesses such as dysentery, smallpox, influenza, and scurvy were constant threats. Medicine existed, but it was often ineffective or harmful. Remedies included herbs, superstition, and prayer. The sick were isolated if possible, but care was minimal. Survival depended on luck more than skill. The evenings brought no comfort. Darkness came early, and firewood was scarce. Candles were a luxury. Lamps burned animal fat or tallow, producing little light. Families huddled close to survive the cold, listening to the wind through cracks in the walls. Conversations were quiet. Silence was both fear and reprieve. Sleep offered little escape. Floors were hard. Bedding was thin, often shared with animals. Infants slept beside parents. Dampness, vermin, and cold made rest fitful. Dreams were rare. Exhaustion dominated the mind. Yet sleep remained a fragile shield against despair. Social bonds mattered. Neighbors helped when possible. Shared food or labor could mean life or death. Weddings, baptisms, and festivals provided brief respite. Music, simple songs, or storytelling offered distraction from suffering. Community was survival, not entertainment. But fear never left entirely. The Lord's demands, disease, famine, and the threat of violence formed a constant backdrop. A missed task, a bad harvest, a cough that lingered, any could become fatal. Life depended on endurance, vigilance, and sometimes quiet desperation. Even in faith, comfort was limited. Church attendance was dictated more by obligation than belief. Clergy offered prayers, guidance, and penance, but they could not ease hunger or heal disease. Religion explained suffering as God's will, a moral trial to endure. For many, it was a reminder of powerlessness. The poor lived in cycles of work and survival, a rhythm defined by scarcity and danger. Each day followed the last: labor, hunger, fear, exhaustion, brief rest, and the return of labor. Death shadowed life. Infancy, childbirth, and old age were especially perilous. Few survived long enough to remember a full life. Yet people persisted. They continued to rise each day, work each hour, and hope, however faintly, for survival. Their lives were not heroic, but they were enduring. The human capacity to adapt and persist in the face of relentless suffering was evident in the smallest acts. tending crops, feeding a child, or sharing a scrap of bread. Life in the village was never secure. Beyond the constant labor and hunger lurked forces that could destroy everything in a single season. Famine was the first and most relentless. Crops failed due to drought, floods, or frost. Grain rotted in storage and seeds were lost. Villagers had no safety nets. A bad harvest could mean weeks of empty stomachs and months of weakening. Hunger became more than discomfort. It became a slow, grinding force that eroded strength, immunity, and hope. Children were the first to suffer. Their small bodies could not endure the lack of nutrition. Swollen bellies, thin limbs, and fevers marked their fragile lives. Many died quietly in their beds, their parents powerless to prevent it. Adults endured longer, but even the strongest succumbed if the famine persisted. Food scarcity transformed families into desperate collectors of anything edible: roots, bark, wild herbs. Starvation sometimes drove people to steal, to beg, to barter objects of value for a scrap of sustenance. Disease followed hunger like a shadow. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making even minor illnesses deadly. Plague, smallpox, typhus, and dysentery swept through villages with little warning. Contagion thrived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. One cough, one infected hand could infect an entire household. Physicians were rare, and their methods often cruel or ineffective. Bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and charms replaced true treatment. Survival was more a matter of luck than knowledge. Outbreaks were terrifying not only for their mortality, but for their unpredictability. Families disappeared quietly. Whole hamlets were emptied within weeks. Burial pits became shallow and crowded. Priests often refused to enter homes for fear of contagion. The living were left to care for the dead as best they could, sometimes stacking bodies in corners or burning them in hurried pyres. The smell of decay was constant. Fear was as tangible as famine. Violence was another force shaping life. Lords, knights, and mercenaries passed through villages like storms. Taxes were exacted in grain, livestock, or labor. Refusal could mean beating, imprisonment, or death. Wars were not abstract events. They tore through fields and homes. Villagers were not soldiers. They were victims. Farms burned, cattle stolen, families scattered. Survival often meant hiding in forests, fleeing at night, or abandoning everything. Law and punishment added another layer of terror. Medieval justice was immediate and severe. A peasant accused of theft could be publicly flogged, mutilated, or executed. Punishments were meant to be visible warnings, often staged in village squares. Even minor offenses could draw extreme consequences. Officials enforced these laws unevenly. Favor, power, and chance determined whether punishment was swift or avoided. Fear of punishment guided behavior as much as hunger or disease. Women endured additional hardships. Childbearing was dangerous, often fatal. Without midwives or skilled care, complications were common. Miscarriage and maternal death were frequent. Beyond childbirth, women labored equally in fields, tended animals, prepared meals, and maintained households. Abuse and domestic violence were common and rarely punished. Widows were especially vulnerable, sometimes reduced to begging or forced labor to survive. Childhood was a fragile stage of existence. From the moment they could walk, children worked. They fetched water, tended animals, and learned the skills necessary for survival. Play was rare, a dangerous indulgence. Education was almost non-existent. Only those born into wealth or the church learned to read, write, or calculate. For the rest, survival was the only curriculum.
Yet, in these conditions, human connection persisted. Communities relied on shared labor, storytelling, prayer, and festivals. Rituals marked rare moments of abundance, such as harvest celebrations or religious feasts. Laughter, music, and stories did not erase suffering, but they preserved humanity. These small acts were not luxuries, they were lifelines. Yet the shadows never left. Each day, villagers faced hunger, disease, labor, violence, and fear. Each season brought new dangers. Life was measured not in years, but in hours survived. Death was constant, inevitable, and familiar. For those at the bottom of society, existence was a careful balance between endurance and despair.
Amid the relentless hardships, the people at the bottom of medieval society found fleeting moments of relief. These were rare and fragile, yet they shaped the rhythm of life and allowed survival to continue. Festivals, religious observances, and communal gatherings provided brief reprieves from hunger, labor, and fear. Religious holidays were the most reliable interruptions of toil. Saints' days, Easter, and Christmas brought not only spiritual significance, but also temporary relief from work. Fields remained unplowed, workshops fell silent, and for a few hours the demands of lords and labor ceased. Bread might be richer, or meat more abundant. Ale flowed freely, and songs were sung. These days were not luxurious, but they were moments when the harshest burdens eased, if only slightly. Marriage, baptism, and funerals also punctuated life with social cohesion. Weddings, though simple for the poor, were times of sharing and feasting. Neighbors contributed food, labor, and gifts. A marriage connected families and sometimes secured alliances or mutual protection. Baptisms marked the beginning of a child's tenuous life and were often the first occasion when the entire community gathered in one place. Funerals reminded everyone of mortality, but also reinforced solidarity. Families and neighbors shared the labor of digging graves and preparing bodies, comforting one another through loss. Even in the darkest periods, stories and songs provided an escape. Minstrels were rare in peasant villages, but oral tradition thrived. Tales of distant lands, heroic deeds, or moral lessons passed from one generation to the next. They were not mere entertainment, they preserved memory, imparted values, and allowed imagination to transcend suffering. In whispered songs at night, children and adults momentarily left the harshness of reality behind. Communal labor could also bring a sense of unity. Harvesting, planting, or building required cooperation. Neighbors shared tools, advised one another, and worked side by side. These shared efforts were sometimes the difference between survival and starvation. They created bonds strong enough to sustain people when disease, hunger, or violence struck. Faith, though often a source of fear, also offered comfort. Daily prayers, lighting candles, and participating in rituals provided a measure of control. The poor could not prevent famine or war, but they could follow religious practices. These acts affirmed their place in the world and suggested that suffering had meaning beyond the immediate moment. Even if hope was small, it persisted. Yet these reprieves were always fragile. A festival could be interrupted by an epidemic. A wedding could be followed by a death. Relief was temporary, a small window in the endless cycle of labor, hunger, and fear. Survival depended on endurance, community, and the human capacity to find light in darkness. Through it all, the body and spirit endured. Hands blistered from tools, backs bent in fields, faces sunburned or pale from malnutrition, and eyes weary from constant vigilance.
These were the marks of ordinary people surviving extraordinary hardship. They were not remembered in chronicles or songs of kings. Their lives left few traces, yet they formed the foundation of society. Without them, cities could not thrive, fields would go untended, and kingdoms would collapse. Life at the bottom was harsh, relentless, and often tragic, but it was also persistent. Each day ended with the knowledge that another day would come. The poor endured because they had no alternative. They adapted, they worked, they prayed, and sometimes they found fleeting joy. Their resilience was quiet, unnoticed, but profound.
Night fell again on the village. Fires burned low. Smoke drifted through cracks in walls. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of cold earth, animals, and distant fields. Inside, families huddled together. Children slept lightly, parents watched, and the sick murmured prayers. Outside, the world was indifferent. Disease, hunger, and violence did not pause. Survival was fragile, tenuous, and never guaranteed. The lives of the poor were measured not in milestones or achievements, but in hours and days survived. Each sunrise brought the same demands: work, hunger, fear, and the hope that the body could endure a little longer. Their existence was defined by repetition and labor, by small acts of care, and by the human capacity to endure despite relentless hardship. Death was constant. Infant mortality, disease, famine, and accidents claimed lives at every stage. Yet, for those who survived, the struggle continued. There was no grand reward, no lasting recognition. Theirs was a quiet endurance, invisible to the chroniclers, poets, and rulers whose names dominate history. Yet even in suffering, these lives were sustained by connection. Communities, however fragile, offered support. Shared labor, small celebrations, and the rare feast provided relief. Stories, songs, and prayers offered a sense of meaning. Faith, even when tinged with fear, gave people a framework to understand their suffering. Survival, in its quiet persistence, became an act of resilience. Life at the bottom of medieval society was ordinary in the truest sense, a continuous, unrelenting negotiation with hunger, disease, labor, and death. It was harsh, often cruel, and rarely recognized. The ordinary people of this era lived with a reality that was relentless, unromantic, and unforgiving. Yet they endured, quietly shaping the world around them, sustaining the foundations of societies that would later be remembered. As the night deepened, the village fell silent. The fires dimmed, the animals slept. The weak rested, the weary slept, and the living prepared for another day of survival. For those at the bottom, life was never certain, but it persisted. Their endurance, though unseen, remains a testament to human resilience in the face of the darkest conditions. The story of these lives is not one of heroism or triumph. It is one of persistence, suffering, and survival. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings, queens, and wars, but by the quiet, relentless struggle of those who lived and died unseen, yet whose existence sustained the world around them.